A layer of disturbed dust swirled into the air, rising as if stirred from an ageless tomb. Ludmilla stared up at the unknown ceiling of a chamber shrouded by eternal night. She shifted where she lay, sending more dust into the air as she turned her head to look around. It was a luxurious suite that must have been 10 times the size of her home in Warden's Vale. The ceiling was arched and supported by columns carved from white limestone. Yet, the beauty of her surroundings was marred. Soot streaked the walls. There was no furniture, only broken stone scattered over the floor. She walked over to the vaulted windows, staring out at the scorched towers looming in the mist. Ludmilla was in Lagos, the lost capital of what Clara dubbed the High Empire — the ruined metropolis that lay at the heart of the Katza Plains. But why was she here? She summoned her memory and immediately regretted it. She had been defeated. Even with the royal army at her command and everything that the Sorceress Kingdom had invested in her, she was bested in every conceivable way. Hopelessly outclassed by a powerful beastman lord. No, he may have been a lord, but he was also something else. With the luxury of quiet and lengthy review, she understood that what he did with his warband was far too structured. She could recognize everything that they had done and could only come to one conclusion: she had fought a true captain, one that could stand amongst the great captains of legend. While she was still struggling to piece together what pittance of capability she could out of limited knowledge and lack of experience, she had come across a master at their craft. The forces that could send the nations of the region into utter despair had been toyed with, rendered helpless before his onslaught and summarily crushed. Ludmilla sighed, brushing the dust off of the edge of the open balcony before sitting down. She straightened and shivered at the cold stone against her rear. It was then that she realized that she was completely naked. Her head turned as she scanned the chamber again, ensuring no one else was around. What in the world is going on here? She was certain that she had died, but it didn't look like anyone had resurrected her. The only signs that someone had frequented the place in the last forever were left by herself. A wraith lazily drifted by, following some mindless routine that it had probably been doing for centuries. Ludmilla leaned forward to examine the city streets below, but the thick mists obscured her vision, making it seem as if she were sitting inside a cloud. Her hand absently went to her waist, but the infinite haversack with her pocket watch obviously wasn't there. There was no way to tell the time of day or even know what day it was. How long had it been since she fell in battle? 10,000 years might have passed for all that she knew. At least a day had gone by based on the last time she had gotten up on her own. Going by that, the battle she had fallen in would be long over. There was nothing further she could do to influence the outcome. The reason why she hadn't been resurrected was probably because she had been found woefully wanting. They had no use for such a useless captain, and civilian nobles were better at managing their territories. Her territory had probably been given over to someone like Lian and transformed into a dismal sprawl of mines and manufactories to achieve the so-called productivity that the central administration desired. Was there any point in showing her face? Maybe it was better to sit in her raised tower for the rest of eternity. The telltale metallic tread of a Death Series patrol rose from mists below, echoing off of the city's alabaster towers. Ludmilla gathered her dangling legs beneath her and stood back from the balcony. Well, it isn't as if hiding in this room forever really helps with anything. As much as she dreaded facing whatever the future held, there was little point in shutting herself away from the world. Maybe she would be able to find a position in the junior household staff of a minor noble. Would Miss Gran hire her? She had a good head on her shoulders and Ludmilla could work as a forester. Surely something like that wouldn't lead to the same catastrophic results that she had produced in her foolish misadventure as an army officer. Ludmilla wandered around the chamber, looking for something to clothe herself with. As expected, she found nothing. Any such articles would be long rotted away even if they had survived the fires. With little other choice, she descended a broad spiral staircase that wound around the tower's central column. Her path took her past dozens of minor undead standing in perfect stillness. She could have probably gone by them unharassed, but she concealed herself anyway, sneaking behind them whenever she could. The rational part of her knew that they were mindless and it didn't matter if they saw her. As a noble, she was also accustomed to her attendants seeing her in various modes of undress, yet something deep inside demanded that she do her best to avoid notice. Perhaps it was because any one of the undead standing around might be a dominated sentry. Being detected would make their controller aware of the naked woman wandering around the city. Yes, That was probably it. They would hunt her down and drag her through the city streets for all to see. Her public indecency would end up becoming part of an official report, forever preserved in the Sorceress Kingdom's administrative archives and used as a case study for every Elder Lich from now until the end of eternity. She padded through the ruin arcade at the bottom of the tower, passing broken fountains and burned-out storefronts on the way to the arching street entrance. Her steps slowed as she strained her senses to detect where the nearest patrols were. While her senses were still far superior to the average person's, they weren't anywhere near as absurd as they were with her equipment, so she took far more time than she was used to. Once she was confident none of the distant patrols was approaching, she scurried across the street to hop into the dust-filled canal running alongside it. According to Elena Grant's journal, the canals were confirmed to be streets as well, thoroughfares for Laga's aquatic and semi-aquatic citizens. The ongoing interpretation of the relic offered insights into the city that were often foreign to regional thinking, so coming back to Laga's to re-envision what the city was like in the past was one of the many things Ludmilla meant to do when she had the chance. She never imagined that it would happen like this, however. Ludmilla made her way downstream to where the canal eventually joined a larger one. The convenient concealment came to an end, however, when that canal completely filled out part way through one of the city's many plazas. Sounds of wagon wheels rumbling over the pavement, people and things being moved around, and a variety of sterile voices issued through the fog from the north. She stopped and cocked an ear to sort them out. "Please stand by for inspection. Is this your first time in the Sorceress Kingdom? Warehousing for goods passing through Irantal is currently being offered at Corlin Harbor." A frown crossed her lips as she overheard the familiar routines. According to Clara, Irantal would grow to absorb Corlin Harbor within a century, so that much time hadn't passed, at least. Unless they were referring to it as a district of the city. That aside, things at least sounded the same as they did when she was last around the Sorceress Kingdom. As slowly as laws and procedures were amended, things still would be significantly changed if decades had passed. Contraband has been detected. Executing Procedure D1. You are under arrest. Resistance is futile. "Oh, no," came a woman's desperate voice. "We wouldn't dare defy the will of the Supreme One. Please punish us until we scream." It sounded like they were practicing the militia duties that would eventually be assigned to them. Unfortunately, the vampire brides seemed to be acting out their role in an entirely wrong way. "One of the suspects has escaped," an elder lich announced. She was last seen headed south with her contraband inventory. A moment later, the ghostly figure of an invisible vampire bride in civilian dress hopped into the canal with Ludmilla. The vampire bride took one long look at her before smiling and placing the satchel she was carrying into Ludmilla's hands. Then, she ran away. "Eh?" Ludmilla winced at the sound of rapidly approaching death knights. She jumped out of the canal and ran south, away from the exercise area. Potential breach of public decency laws. Escalation to Procedure D3 as advised. State morality must be enforced. She sprinted into a large ruin on the southwestern end of the plaza, scurrying up the stairs and streaking through the corridors. On the way, she tossed the satchel of illegal goods into the entrance of a collapsed room. After that, she jumped out of a back window and into the window of the next building over. After going from building to building for several city blocks, she landed on the wharf along the Katza River. A vampire bride in the uniform of the Postal Service raised her clipboard to cover her mouth. "Oh my," her crimson gaze seemed to twinkle. "Is our mistress playing another game with you, my lady? Might there be room for another?" Ludmilla stared at Vampire Bride for a long moment. The Vampire Bride stared back, though not in the same way. While they were generally pleasant and businesslike when dealing with the public, Lady Shiltier's vampire brides were every bit as lewd as their mistress. Each was about as sadistic as their predatory nature might suggest, but they were also unapologetic masochists who only saw being hunted, punished, abused and even killed by Lady Shiltier as an exquisite reward. "No, she's not," Ludmilla replied. Is Lady Shiltier here?" "Not that I am aware of, my lady," the vampire bride replied. "Shall I ask one of the elder liches to contact her for you?" "Yes, please. By the way, what are the time and date?" "It is 6 o'clock in the evening on the 30th day of Middlewind month, in the first year of our Lord." "I see." It seemed that a whole day had passed. More than enough time for everything to have concluded and for everyone to make their conclusions. All she could do now was stew in her regrets. The vampire bride turned to head down the wharf toward the harbor master's office. "Wait," Ludmilla said. "Might I borrow something to wear?" In response, the vampire bride reached into her inventory, pulling out the sheer alabaster fabrics that were their default garb. When Ludmilla imagined herself wearing it, her soul recoiled at the pitiful image. "What about something like a postal worker uniform?" she asked. The vampire bride reached up to unfasten her coat. After she handed it over, she pulled her shirt over her head. The full force of the femininity contained within was violently unleashed upon Ludmilla. "Just the coat will do," she said quickly. She followed the vampire bride past the rows of containers filled with goods for the Draconic Kingdom. The undead busy at work didn't spare her as much as a glance, which she was grateful for. She took a seat at one of the desks in the harbor master's office and idly stared at the rates posted on the wall. Do the elder liches here use the postal service at all? Maybe they mail-ordered office furniture or something. 15 minutes later, the black portal of a gate appeared outside of the office. Lady Shiltir entered, dressed in her usual black ballroom gown. Ludmilla rose from her seat, genuflecting before her liege. "It's about time you got up," Lady Shiltir said. "My most heartfelt apologies, my lady." Ludmilla stared at the stone floor. For everything. She tensed as she waited for her punishment to be declared. It wouldn't surprise her if she found herself waking up a week later in yet another dusty tower. "I don't recall anything that requires an apology," Lady Shiltir said. "My lady. Your frustrations may lead you to believe that you've done something wrong, but Lord Ine said that you carried out your orders to his satisfaction. He noted several things of interest while watching your performance, as well." "He did? No, wait, he was watching me?" "That's right," Lady Shiltir told her. "He was observing the entire battle at Eastwatch." Ludmilla slouched forward, going to her hands and knees. She crawled under the nearby desk, curling up with the vampire bride's coat covering her head. His Majesty had seen everything. She wasn't sure how much more complete her mortification could be. Something poked her in the shoulder. "Are you all right?" Lady Shiltir asked. "No," Ludmilla answered. "If I could burrow like Kilishnish, I'd have buried myself in a hole by now." "You can dig your holes later," Lady Shiltir said. "You still have a function to attend." "A function, my lady?" Clara said something about the first set of formal agreements between the Sorceress Kingdom and the Draconic Kingdom. A pair of loud thumps issued through the top of the desk. Ludmilla poked her head out to find her infinite haversacks sitting there. "As the Royal Army's liaison to Orokalon's royal court," Lady Shiltir told her, "your duties await." "I can't be reading this right." Leanne wasn't the only one thinking that. Sitting at her delegation's desk in the throne room of Orokalon Palace, Clara wasn't sure she was reading things right, either. Before her was a small collection of documents penned on embossed noble paper, which consisted of the diplomatic and commercial agreements proposed by the Draconic Kingdom. They were more than anything Clara had imagined they might achieve in their rush to salvage the situation in the southeast. It was not the fact that the proposals had been made, however. That much was a given after all that had happened. It was what those proposals implied. They were a prelude to something far greater, something she didn't dare hope for so early in their efforts. "This is a good thing, isn't it?" "It's not about it being good or bad, it's about it being impossible. At least I think it's impossible. After what I've seen of this country and its people, it seems entirely possible. But it's as if our reality isn't the same as theirs. It's ludicrous." Indeed, that was Clara's first thought upon digesting the details. The implications were utterly ludicrous to anyone who possessed the common sense of the human countries north of the theocracy. In a different way, it was also beyond the common sense of the theocracy itself. If their time as nobles of the Sorceress Kingdom had taught them anything, however, it was that the reality that they were raised in was actually wrong. If one asked any aristocrat, bureaucrat, or sovereign in the north what they would do if their country had been subjected to occupation and had lost 60% of its population, their first reaction would be to throw up their hands with a laugh and say that they were doomed. That sort of catastrophe put a country on such weak footing that trying to put together a recovery effort simply wasn't enough. It was the beginning of a downward spiral where their clear weakness would invite further invasion not only by the tribes and monsters that dwelled along their borders, but also by other nations seeing an irresistible opportunity to make gains for themselves. Even if it didn't happen by some miracle, a nation's leaders would focus on domestic affairs, restoring its gutted population over generations while nursing its shattered economy back to health. That logic didn't seem to apply to the Draconic Kingdom. The Draconic Kingdom's proposals contained a very clear plan for those who had the eyes to see it. It was as good as a promise put to paper. In a word, they were expanding. Clara had a feeling that they would explore the diplomatic avenues once closed off to them by their relationship with the slain theocracy, but she never expected it to happen so quickly and so aggressively. In a situation where kings and emperors might despair, Queen Auriculus instead went on the offensive and her entire country was ready for it. Her first move was to consolidate her surviving subjects into the most productive lands of the Draconic Kingdom, namely the coastline and the lower riverlands. The unmanaged territories would be patrolled by security forces leased from the Sorceress Kingdom. From there, the Draconic Kingdom's efforts would not be focused on eventually repopulating the unmanaged territories in the east, but on the south. 3 new cities were being chartered on the sea along the Draconic Kingdom's southern coast. Those cities were but the first step to an even greater objective, which was to open the Cerulean Way. The tribes and countries of aquatic demi-humans, heteromorphs and even monsters that had shared a long, peaceful relationship with the Draconic Kingdom were included in the effort. According to the Draconic Kingdom's royal court, the ones that they had contacted had already agreed to the Queen's proposals and even welcomed the expansion of her domain. The piles of pearls, coral, precious stones and various unknown objects sitting at the base of her throne were all expressions of goodwill that her envoys had returned with. "I thought we were saving a kingdom, but it looks like we've gained an empire. You seem to be having trouble digesting our proposal." From atop her marble throne, Queen Auriculus regarded them with a look of mild amusement. All of the fear and uncertainty they had seen from her in the past seemed to have vanished. Even the terrible sense of danger that lingered about her before the Battle of Eastwark was gone. In its place was a feeling of serenity. While still childlike in appearance, she no longer gave any indication of being one. Instead, she gave off the air of what she truly was, a being that had lived for many human generations, possessing wisdom and experience beyond that of any common mortal. "I admit that it wasn't in line with our expectations, Your Majesty," Clara replied. Considering that half of Argland is underwater, the Queen smirked, "It should hardly be a surprise." "Well, it isn't as if we don't understand your confusion. Human perception aside, the cultural influence of the theocracy is strong in the north. With the advent of the Sorceress Kingdom, however, that influence will be dispelled sooner or later." "But will things work out as these proposals suggest, Your Majesty?" Leanne asked. "There will be many things to work out," Queen Auriculus answered, "but they should. The Draconic Kingdom has maintained good relations with its aquatic neighbors since before we were born. Honestly, it's not too hard since there are boundaries that one cannot cross even if one wanted to. As long as treaties are respected, things tend to go in favorable directions. What Your Majesty proposes for the future is different, though," Leanne said. "All of those aquatic tribes and countries must have conflicts between themselves." "Oh, they do. But they have also existed alongside one another all this time. As nobles from a multiracial country, you would do well to understand that ruling over many races is more a matter of guidance than it is of raw power. At best, raw power is a means by which one is afforded the opportunity to lay a lasting foundation for such a country." Did that mean that she would be running her country much as Ludmilla did her territories? Her human development aside, the style of management that Ludmilla enacted could be described as loose or even next to non-existent. Most of the population lived as they always had, with some caveats. She was in no rush to encourage the type of development most nobles aimed for, instead focusing on weaving a cultural tapestry that all of her subjects could be a part of. That aside, the most important aspect of Queen Auriculus' proposals, to both Clara and Lady Albedo, at least, was that they were well on their way to establishing the diplomatic and economic foothold that Clara had originally proposed for the southeast. If things went as Queen Auriculus suggested, they would be running years or even decades ahead of schedule. Everything needed to be re-evaluated, recalculated and adjusted to match. It was all to the Sorceress Kingdom's benefit, however. Lady Albedo would likely be pleased that at least one front was advancing faster than planned since the others didn't seem to be getting anywhere very quickly. "These changes to agricultural production," Florian spoke up. "They appear to be well above what we've stated our current demand to be. May we ask your majesty where it will be going? Not very far, Queen Auriculus replied. Those industries will grow in line with the demands to the east in the future. The market in the Sorceress Kingdom is just what we need to get things going. The east? Do you mean with the beastmen? Yes, that's right. I see. I don't, Leanne said. Can you really just show up one day and say, hey, we have stuff for sale, and the people that have been eating you for generations suddenly change tag? Not to mention them getting over 1 million of their people obliterated here just recently. Yes, we can. A disgruntled look leaked out from behind Leanne's mask. Queen Auriculus covered her growing smile. One must consider the circumstances in which everything has happened, she said. You may feel that the beastmen attacking the Draconic Kingdom was some special case, but we will have you know that it isn't. Friction between different races is common in the world. It is common, and the solutions are also common. Those different races may not be human, but they are not as inhuman as many in this region believe them to be. Also, tribal types are especially honest in various ways. We will not have any major issues dealing with them now that we actually can. All right, I'll give your majesty that much, but there's still the whole thing with the undead. Leanne jerked to the side as Florian's elbow found her ribs. She was getting too sloppy with her speech. Queen Auriculus, however, only tilted her head curiously. Why would the undead be a problem? She asked. We will just let them know what happened. Why, you will? Of course. There's little point in saying otherwise. We have a 1,000-year lease on your undead, so they aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Many believe that the admission of what they consider shameful or reprehensible leaves them at a political disadvantage, but those games of power and deception are simply not worth playing most of the time. What's done is done, and they can only move on from there. Besides, what I did was far worse. It is something I must take responsibility for. Is that a part of why you've left your eastern territories unmanaged, Your Majesty? Ludmilla asked. The Marshal's security arrangements were a surprise. According to Ludmilla, the undead security forces were limited to patrolling a small buffer zone just beyond the inhabited provinces of the Draconic Kingdom. Additionally, their orders weren't to summarily execute any beastmen that they came across, but to drive them away. It is the first step, Queen Auriculus nodded. While I cannot return what I have stolen, I can help nurture what grows in its place. Leaving the land wild and open for hunting for the time being will help speed their recovery. Hopefully, this will also help with the problems that they will surely face elsewhere after losing so many of their warriors. In time, I will see to it that they have a chance to enter the Sorceress Kingdom's sphere of influence in a not-so-unfortunate way. We will be sure to inform our royal court of your intentions. Ludmilla sent Clara a look. Clara nodded in return. Good, the Queen smiled. Now, we believe that our proposals satisfy the objectives of your royal court? The Sorceress Kingdom is ushering in a new order. Rather than coming to the Draconic Kingdom as a conqueror, it has extended its hand in friendship. As such, we can only believe that you desire strong, independent voices in your hegemony to legitimize its status as a benevolent actor on the world stage. Everything that we have done so far has been to accommodate this, and we shall continue to do so for as long as it is the Sorceress Kingdom's intent. Yes, Your Majesty, Clara replied. That is exactly what we came here to do. I will deliver your proposals to the royal court for review, but I can only imagine that they will be pleased with these developments. Thank you for your cooperation, understanding and patience. We look forward to working with you in the future. Clara and her delegation rose from their seats, lowering their heads before the Queen. Though everything had happened in an entirely roundabout and unexpected way, the Sorceress Kingdom's diplomacy appeared to be off to an exceptional start. 6th day, lower wind month, 1 CE. I don't get it. Ainz kept a straight face as Albedo rolled out a seemingly endless parade of reports before him. Those reports were accompanied by arrays of projections and, worst of all, questions, requests for feedback from the Sorcerer King and his supreme intellect over any number of esoteric mysteries contained within the documents piled upon his desk. He often compared Nazarick to a company with himself as its CEO. He believed that he could guide that company in a decent direction, considering the direction things would take if he let the NPCs have their way. It was more that he felt that he had to, but vague directions were all that he could manage. As was the case with many poor children, The young Suzuki Satoru often fantasized about being the head of a megacorporation despite his elementary education, asserting in no uncertain terms that those fantasies would never become reality. Those fantasies were, of course, filled with childlike dreams such as eating solid food once a month or feeling real grass between his toes for once in his life. It went without saying that he would also be a great leader, making perfect decisions that awed all of his subordinates and invariably led to success. Those fantasies did not include sitting through hours-long meetings trying to make sense of reports from subordinates that were far more capable than he. Albert often shook his virtual fist at the despots sitting on the boards of the megacorporations and how they only saw people as statistics while pursuing productivity at any cost. Now that he was in a similar position, however, Ainz couldn't for the life of him figure out how they could have seen things any other way. Numbers summarized everything that went on in the Sorcerous Kingdom and the places where it involved itself. Even things like public sentiment, quality of life and other feely aspects were quantified and transformed into a variety of indices using several models that Albedo deemed suitable for use in governance. This wasn't a bad thing in itself. As a ruler, he had neither the time nor the capability to know every minute detail of the territories falling under the rapidly expanding influence of the Sorcerous Kingdom. Nor could he know every one of his subjects personally and do something about every unique circumstance. Never mind himself, it was impossible for anyone to do it on their own. All he could do was trust those who ran the country in his name to do what needed to be done. It was said that Emperor Jerkniv desired an administrative apparatus that would allow him to lead the empire using broad strokes in national policy. When Ainz had first heard that, he thought it a novel idea that would allow him to live in relative luxury. Now, he realized that the reason why the emperor desired such a thing was that broad strokes were all that a sovereign could reasonably make. Of course, Nazarik's NPCs didn't see things that way. He did what he did because he somehow knew everything and how every event would play out. With this understanding, they took it upon themselves to carry out his unfathomable will. Ainz Summer, Albedo's mellow voice shook him out of his thoughts. Now that we've reviewed the Draconic Kingdom's proposals, are there any objections or amendments you would like to make? He glanced over the summary again, making a show of thoughtful consideration. These numbers and projections already appear excellent as they are. There wasn't much to complain about. The Sorcerous Kingdom had forged official diplomatic and trade links with the Draconic Kingdom, and it wasn't achieved under duress. On top of that, they had signed a 1,000-year lease for 60 infantry squads, plus a support staff of elder liches to help with communications and military coordination. The entire bundle consisted of 950 middle-tier undead. In terms of sales, it was the equivalent of scoring a major defense contract, one that would last a millennium. His old company would have thrown an office party with 4 different flavors of nutrient paste in addition to giving everyone a half day off for making the sale. It was that big of a deal. Now, all we have to do is make sure we satisfy our end of the contract. We should throw in some free service once in a while, too. That always makes clients happy. Albedo projects massive growth in the Draconic Kingdom for the long term, so this is definitely a customer we want to keep. Since they're expanding, they should be upgrading their contract as they go. I should think up some promotions. Maybe he could finally get around to implementing the rewards program he was considering before he left for Oblate. He had given up on it after discovering that Demiurge didn't intend to promote undead leases in the Holy Kingdom. As a consolation, Ainz squeezed in his runecraft promotion, but that effort was an absolute flop. As his thoughts started to wander, he realized that Albedo was patiently awaiting the remainder of his response. He cleared his throat. In fact, you seemed far less agitated over these results from the Draconic Kingdom than you were with the reports from Baharuth and Riestais. He couldn't decipher the technical aspects of the reports, but he could certainly feel Albedo's frustrations over the latter two as they went over them. Riestais was getting nowhere quickly. There were more apologies and excuses from the local collaborators there than anything else. The puppet faction that had been created was filled with blind fools who gave little thought to the power and wealth being lent to them. Each one had aspirations born from their respective delusions, and Albedo's agents struggled to manage them. At the present, they couldn't be considered a faction beyond the most cursory sense of the term, and they were far from the point where they could be employed for Nazarik's purposes. Even so, he couldn't rightly complain. They were gathered precisely because they were the dregs of Reistize's aristocratic society, spares who previously had no hope of inheritance and were thus afforded little in the way of a noble's education by their impoverished houses. At least the leader that they had set up for the faction appeared to be firmly under Albedo's control. Based on the letters he wrote to her, he was completely besotted. They were so cringeworthy that even Albedo couldn't maintain her ever-present smile of perfect composure when reading them aloud to him. The Empire faced a somewhat similar set of issues, though those issues were entirely self-inflicted. The great minds of Nazarick were possibly the only people in the world who would call Jerkniv a fool, but, after the situation was explained to him, even Ainz could see where they were coming from. During the bloody ascension that was the source of his epitaph, the then Crown Prince eliminated all of his rivals for the throne. In addition to that, he eliminated their supporters and other political opponents. After he took the throne, the Emperor continued his policy of strengthening imperial authority by purging those that resisted his dictates and those who were considered incompetent. It seemed like a sound practice in theory, but the reality of things was far from it. While seen as all sorts of other, often derogatory, things, nobles were the managers of imperial society. As a result, the Emperor's campaign to root out threats to legitimacy, political opponents, and incompetence also resulted in the gutting of the Empire's administrative class. He was so focused on doing what he was doing that the only reason that he stopped was because the imperial administration was on the verge of collapse. Things had gotten so bad that the Emperor himself had to personally shoulder the administrative burden his actions had created. Imperial propaganda purportedly spun the entire affair as the necessary cleansing of a corrupt old regime. Quite frankly, so long as the common citizen perceived that their lives were stable and secure, they didn't care what happened. The fact of the matter, however, was that the Empire had hamstrung itself. The key to understanding the conundrum lay in the fact that the system of education in the region was not the same as that of Suzuki Satoru's world. The countries in the region used the guild system, which was mostly identical to the guild system that dominated Earth's history for thousands of years. There was no such thing as universal education, and educational standards were dictated by the guilds. That education was also highly specialized, with its students entering into master-apprentice relationships as early as the age of 4 or 5. Administrators were also part of a guild, which was known locally as the nobility. As with any guild, its members were responsible for raising the next generation out of their own number. And, so, by purging the nobility, Jerkniv had crippled his administration. Masters were limited because he had killed many of them. Students were similarly limited because he had stripped many houses of their titles. There was no such fantasy as a nameless boy from a farming village joining the ranks of the imperial administration. That was simply not how things worked. Farmers were raised as farmers. Blacksmiths were raised as blacksmiths. Most people would be considered illiterate by the imperial administration, never mind trained to manage a piece of the empire according to imperial standards. If such an uneducated person did manage to somehow sneak their way into the position, they would be cut down even faster than their predecessors for incompetence. In that sense, Jerkniv's privileged upbringing was telling. It was a catastrophic spin on the old tale of the rich kid who had no idea how food arrived at his table. Just like a sheltered sign of an ultra-wealthy family in Suzuki Satoru's world or a fresh graduate from the colleges of the elite, Jerkniv had descended from on high to eliminate a problem that he had personally invested himself in. His solution was so arbitrary and narrowly focused that it caused as many problems as it fixed. To make things worse, the Empire's meritocracy wasn't some egalitarian dream. The Empire and its citizens firmly believed that everyone deserved the situation that they were in. One was poor because they deserved to be poor, and the successful deserved their success. As a poor commoner that grew up under the unyielding boot of Earth's megacorporations, Ainz saw the Empire's meritocracy for what it was, utter nonsense. It was a game rigged from top to bottom where the elite were both empowered and incentivized to cherry-pick the finest products and people that their nation had to offer. Every commoner that made it served to draw everyone's gaze away from 10,000 others who didn't deserve it, encouraging the population to grind themselves to dust for the sake of the elite. The Empire had no interest in leveling the playing field. Everything it did was for the sake of strengthening its central authority. Education was private and tuition was paid for out of pocket at every level. Thus, the next generation of administrators would be just as limited as the one that had been purged. The replacements that Jerkniv seemed to expect would never arrive unless educational reform was implemented, which wouldn't happen. Only those who were worthy of attention were allowed to crawl to the foot of the imperial throne, and they had to crawl there by their own merit. Of course, Albedo, who was nominally responsible for transforming the empire into a productive client state, had absolutely no issues with their approach. She actually preferred things that way. It was a single, centralized authority with an iron grip on the reins of power that was in turn solely answerable to the royal court of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. A single channel to communicate her expectations and demands was all that she required, and the imperial dream was a convenient scheme that kept the unwashed masses in their place. Strangely enough, the Draconic Kingdom was something of the opposite of the Empire, yet they were shaping up to be the most fruitful out of all of the Sorceress Kingdom's ventures in foreign affairs. Ainz pondered the mystery for the 10th time that meeting. "So do you believe the Draconic Kingdom's systems might be useful to us?" he asked. "I believe that the Draconic Kingdom is a valuable case study," Albedo answered. "Their systems are far more resilient than the ones in Roble, Riestais and Baharuth. If the same amount of stress applied to the Draconic Kingdom was applied to any of the aforementioned countries, they would surely collapse. In fact, Roble didn't even experience a tenth of it during Yaldabaoth's invasion, and they are well on their way to becoming entirely dependent on us for their continued existence. I recall your approval over just that." "Yes, Ein Summer. But, beneath the Draconic Kingdom's sickening veneer of good, there are some very real mechanisms at work. We must study and learn to take advantage of them in our domestic affairs. They would be especially useful for establishing distant colonies with limited support, perhaps something like a puppet kingdom on the unclaimed fringes of the world. If we can achieve results similar to what the Draconic Kingdom has, we would have entire empires waiting to join us once our sphere of influence expands into their region. If they are prosperous, we would add their prosperity to ours. If they are at war, we would enter on their side. Either way, the Sorceress Kingdom profits from sculpting the geopolitical landscape in advance of its arrival." It was a truly adventurous notion. Thus far, the nations they had encountered had been rather uninspiring when it came to any sense of true romance or fantasy. They were more like reality with a fantasy label, and the vast majority of everything seemed mundane when placed alongside his expectations. "In that case," he said, "I look forward to the fruit of your studies. Your servant will do her utmost to please you, Ein Summer." A knock sounded on his office door. Sixus appeared, lowering her head before them. "Pandora's actor Summer has arrived for his scheduled appointment, Ein Summer." "Oh, is it that time already? I'm sorry, Albedo, but..." "Of course, Ein Summer. It only brings me joy to know you feel that time flies by when we're together, for I feel the same way." Albedo leaned closer as the excitement in her tone escalated. The scent of her perfume wafted over him as she folded her hands together in a way that emphasized her ample cleavage. Ainz's mouth fell open and his emotional suppression kicked in. "Damn it, I should know better than to say anything that might encourage her by now." Albedo made her way out of the office, hips swaying as if inviting Ainz to join her. Pandora's actor entered the room with a spring in his step, carrying a barrel full of longswords. Ainz forcefully shifted his gaze to the collection of items, trying to figure out what absurdity the doppelganger was about to unleash upon him. "Ein Summer. I have arrived." Yes, you have." The door to the office clicked shut. The barrel in Pandora's actor's arms hit the floor with a thump. "So this is what you wanted to see me about?" "Indeed. They represent the fruit of my investigations thus far, behold." Pandora's actor drew one of the swords from the barrel, holding it aloft. Ainz couldn't tell what sort of expression the doppelganger was making as he stared up at it. The sword itself didn't seem like anything special. "It's a sword," Ainz stated flatly. As expected of Ein Summer. "This is, indeed, a sword. A sword of masterwork quality by the standards of the Swordsmith Guild. Bear Mark V. How would I know that at a glance? I don't have any job classes with item appraisal abilities. Also, Bear Mark V?" A low chuckle rose from Pandora's actor, one that slowly grew as it reverberated off of the walls of the office. Bear Mark V, Pandora's actor intoned. An ingenious name. One which all but laughs defiantly in the face of common knowledge. "This is the proof that you have sent me to find." Pandora's actor placed the longsword on Ainz's desk. The weapon's pommel was decorated with the head of a bear. It wasn't made to look like a real bear, but one that might be found on a stuffed toy. Did you order this? Are you referring to the pommel? No. If I had, I would have asked for something more dignified. The weaponsmith that made this puts it on all of her products. I can't imagine they'd sell very well, despite being of masterwork quality. Her client is the Royal Army, and I doubt it matters for the exercises that they're used in. Nay, what matters here is the crafter. Or more precisely, her age. The weaponsmith that produced this masterwork longsword is 7 years old. Umu. Precisely. Pandora's actor snatched the sword from the table. It is precisely as you say, Iron Summer. While this item may be painfully plain by our standards, a longsword of this quality is, as the name implies, only produced by master weaponsmiths. The doppelganger danced around the room, his mustard coat swirling around him as he worked the weapon in ways that Ainz was forced to admit were cool. This is hard evidence that the citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom can be power-leveled not just in combat job classes as Mare has proven, but in civilian vocations, as well. He had to admit it was strange. Ainz's idea of a master smith before he ended up in their new world was that of a grizzled old man with big muscles, a work apron, and a gruff demeanor. While he quickly found it to be explicitly untrue, smiths were known to graduate from journeyman as early as 16. The youngest of them was still over twice the age of the weaponsmith in question. Furthermore, it more than spanned the gap between child and adult. How was this achieved? Ainz asked, his curiosity piqued. Through a certain scheme set in motion by a certain Baroness Ludmilla Zarodnik. Why is she still a baroness, by the way? Baron, Viscount, and Count were just different levels of middle management to him. The only reasoning he could come up with was that she had the least productive human territory in the Sorceress Kingdom by a vast margin. Of course, various things went into that, which Albedo had probably explained but Ainz had forgotten, but if the other fiefs in Erantle were akin to entire sales districts, the numbers that Baroness Zarodnik's territory put out were like those of a minor retail outlet in a poor neighborhood by comparison. Still, it wasn't his department. He felt that it would be organizationally problematic if he went over the heads of his subordinates. You'll have to ask Shiltir about that, Ainz said. Baroness Zarodnik is her vassal, after all. Anyway, you were saying something about a scheme? Indeed, Pandora's actor stopped twirling about. A clever scheme that simulates a protracted conflict and the economy required to support it. It is a part of her ongoing effort to develop Warden's Vale into a military base, amongst other things. So you're saying that this child weaponsmith is producing equipment for that simulation, and leveled as a result? If he thought about it that way, it did make sense. The capabilities of individuals in their new world were dictated by their job class levels. Age was not a barrier to progress, and it was often the case that young prodigies appeared that surpassed those who were many decades their senior. That is correct, Ainz Summer. The doppelganger nodded. I have always suspected it to be the case, but the relatively low levels of the natives are the result of a combination of factors. Primarily, economic realities bar one from leveling too quickly. A smith cannot afford to produce items without end, they must work within the constraints that their business allows. Furthermore, their business is entirely banal. The average smith is not commissioned to fashion great works that push the limits of their capabilities. They are instead tasked to manufacture nails, repair tools, and produce replacement parts for all of their lives. Our work with the Adventurer Guild indicates that effort, will, and challenge are all components of the formula that leads to growth. Kills matter not, so I assume that the volume of completed goods an artisan produces similarly does not matter. With the data provided by our work not only in the Sorceress Kingdom, but also in the entire region, we can definitively say that this formula applies to civilian vocations. The information coming in from the Draconic Kingdom only solidifies our case. Ainz stared at Pandora's actor for a long moment, the gears in his empty head grinding away. What did the Draconic Kingdom have to do with any of this? So, leveling. Ozshaden Verdmantlug, Pandora's actor shrugged. And the Draconic Kingdom is, in effect, the very picture of this process put to work by the natives of this world. They may not possess our knowledge of Yggdrasil, but one does not need to know how fire works to come up with applications for it. Nay, the process of progress works the other way around. These difficulty ratings, guild ranks, and the many other measures like them are simply the way that the natives of this world qualify and quantify its systems. And, For all practical purposes, it works, leading to the complex institutions that you see around us. The state of every country that we have observed can be in most part explained by how efficiently their institutions harness the systems of this world. But the Holy Kingdom was in a somewhat similar situation to the Draconic Kingdom, Ines noted. How would you explain that? They were and they weren't. Perhaps it is a matter of intensity. The Holy Kingdom of Roble was indeed subject to the predations of their vastly superior demi-human neighbors, but it wasn't to the same degree as the Draconic Kingdom. For the most part, the realities of the Holy Kingdom placed them in the same bucket as Riastais and Baharuth. Their situation was never severe enough to force them to reevaluate how they did things. The Great Wall that they built is symbolic of that thinking. What we have in here is fine, all we have to do is protect it, or something to that effect. It may be as you say, Ines said, but the Draconic Kingdom was arguably doing the worst out of the countries we have involved ourselves in. That depends on how one frames things. Pandora's actor finally decided to take his seat across the desk. From certain absolute perspectives, the Draconic Kingdom was on the verge of complete failure. However, as far as the local law is concerned, human nations as a whole tend to fail. They are simply too weak to stand on their own. As low-leveled as the vast majority of beings in this world seem to be, it is a foregone conclusion with the advantages offered by racial class levels. As such, one must look past the obvious, to how these weak humans can succeed. Once one does that, it becomes clear that the Draconic Kingdom is highly optimized according to the rules of this world. In terms of its overall motif, it is a country that is good. Good. He was rapidly losing the grasp he thought that he had on the discussion. What did good or evil have to do with anything? The mundane rationality of the region segregates certain actions according to a sort of moral spectrum, if you will, Pandora's actor said. Consider the case of a blacksmith in today's Draconic Kingdom compared to one in today's Holy Kingdom. Catastrophe has struck both countries recently and, now, recovery efforts are underway. A challenge, so to speak. How does each blacksmith respond to that challenge? What are the means provided to them? The Draconic Kingdom enacts the good approach. Its sovereign is open-handed and the required economic and social infrastructure is in place to facilitate the rapid recovery of the nation. From its highest aristocrats to its meanest farmhands, everyone is driven to rebuild before the next round of raids ravages their region. They are all participants in a grand, collective effort and enact sets of carefully tailored information cascades. From our perspective, it is a national power-leveling effort. To those who do not understand what is going on, it appears as pure, irrational fantasy. They do not perceive all of the mechanisms that combine to amplify the Draconic Kingdom's efforts into the result that manifests in reality. Unfortunately for the Draconic Kingdom, the fruit of that effort gets eaten on a regular basis, for they ultimately run into the wall that lies between themselves and their much more powerful neighbors. Fortunately for us, that is no longer the case and they have entered into a mutually beneficial relationship with the Sorcerer's Kingdom. I see, Ines stroked his chin. Then how would you frame what's going on in the Holy Kingdom? The exact opposite? Pandora's actor tilted his head curiously. Evil, in a word. Laws are being reformed to become more draconian in the name of recovery. Resources and manpower are being funneled through the agents that we've placed, delivered according to a strategy that promotes ruthless competition and resentment between its citizens. The unscrupulous and selfish thrive at the expense of their fellows. A place where one may rise above all others by casting all others aside. Any good that exists outside of the pawn that you've created is aggressively discouraged. Demiurge is maximizing productivity while at the same time breaking their existing society apart. In time, the Holy Kingdom will be reshaped to suit our needs, though I cannot say whether one will be able to call it a Holy Kingdom by the end of everything. Ines wasn't sure whether that was at all necessary, but if Demiurge foresaw a need for it, then it was probably best to not say anything. Pandora's actor didn't seem to feel strongly about it either way, but it was hard to tell what he was thinking with a face like his. In that case, Ines straightened in his chair, one might say that everything is going according to plan. Indeed, Ines Summer. Pandora's actor rose from his seat and offered a crisp salute. We are ever grateful for your guidance in these matters. Whenever I reflect on the fact that everything that has happened so far has been according to Ines Summer's grand design, I am struck with awe at the glimpses that you offer of your supreme intellect. Umu, Ines could only reply with a regal nod. Speaking of intellect, Demiurge is the only one out of the three of you that didn't schedule a meeting. Do you have any idea where he is? Pandora's actor's hand lowered slightly to drum his cheek with his long fingers. I'm not sure where he is, exactly, the doppelganger replied, but I'm sure that he's seeing to another one of his many plans. KHHSCHLR crashed through the brush, tripping on a root and landing face first in the mud. The bunny she was chasing bounded away and out of sight. She lay where she was for a moment before her stomach growled, and then rolled onto her back with a frustrated cry. How could they do this to me? After all that I've done for them. They had no appreciation for her. None at all. Decades of her life had been dedicated to the future of Rolengork. Of both her life and her beloved Drithers. In the end, they cast her aside like she was nothing. She didn't even have Drither anymore. No, it was worse than being cast aside, it was exile. That, of course, meant that she had to find her own way forward. But it wasn't in any way simple. She had no clan and no allies, no one to call a friend. She had no territory, and that of course meant that she had nowhere to hunt, unless she dared hunt in someone else's territory, which she had just tried. In short, she had been sentenced to death. Her choices were either slowly going mad as she succumbed to starvation, or being killed for poaching. KHHSCHLR had chosen the latter, but she was so terrible at hunting that the former might happen anyway. Maybe the local clan's hunters were watching unseen, laughing at her pitiful attempts to feed herself. Maybe I should just lie here until I die. This world has nothing left for me. Something landed on her stomach. Her paw moved to find a dead bunya there. In the branches overhead, someone was watching her. Who's there? A figure hopped down from the canopy, her dark wings and tail spread wide as she alighted on the ground beside her. KHHSCHLR's eyes narrowed upon realizing it wasn't one of the local Osalo. At first, she believed it to be a female humanoid, but it had the head of a crow. Black feathers covered her arms and lower legs, which ended in human hands and black hooves. The rest of her figure was clad in a tight leather outfit that emphasized her humanoid form. You are the sage, KHHSCHLR? The stranger asked as she regarded KHHSCHLR with the left side of her bird's head. Yes, that's right. I've been searching for you. Word of your great exploits has reached many ears. Is that so? Indeed, the stranger nodded with a sorrowful voice. It is such a tragedy for all of your efforts to go unrecognized. But worry not, KHHSCHLR, your spectacular talents are not lost on us. One of my colleagues is especially enamored at how you sought to bring happiness to so many. A dark hole opened over the shadows of the jungle floor. KHHSCHLR sat up, her hunger shoved aside by her curiosity over the sight. I have come to make you an offer, good sage, the stranger said. A great venture presents itself, one much better suited to your abilities than this savage jungle filled with ignorant primitives. KHHSCHLR's gaze fell inward. It was clear that there was nothing left for her in Rolengork, so what did she have to lose? Except, I am but a humble sage. KHHSCHLR rose to her feet and picked the soggy leaves from her fur. While I may indeed have much to offer, I cannot do everything alone. Worry not, a smile seemed to creep into the stranger's voice. You will find that we have a fine selection of assistants for you to choose from. It may be that you have even encountered a few of them in the past. In that case, KHHSCHLR said, I have no objections about joining you. By the way, I don't believe you offered me your name? The stranger regarded her for a moment. KHHSCHLR felt a chill travel down her spine. You may call me Sarklas, the stranger told her. Come, let us be away. Our work awaits.